everyone. I'm Dr. Patti Peeples, and welcome to the next episode of Patti's People, sponsored by the Evidence Base. Today, I'm delighted to welcome our guest, Dr. Ramiro Gilardino. Ramiro has a long and extensive background in as a senior market access and health policy leader. His work focuses on pricing and reimbursement strategy, as well as European market access. He advises organizations on complex issues like reference pricing, joint clinical assessment, and launch sequencing under uncertainty. He is also a CrossFit Level 2 coach, a role that shapes how he thinks about communication, sequencing, and performance under pressure. Ramiro is interested in how we communicate value clearly and credibly. Welcome, Ramiro. I'm really glad to have you here today.
Thanks, Patty. Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Well, today we're going to focus on international pricing. Can you set the stage for us, Ramiro? When we talk about pricing and pricing reform, most favored nation in the United States, and reference pricing outside of the U.S., what is actually changing and what are the relevant dates of implementation that we need to understand?
Thanks, Patty. And I think what's really changing right now is that pricing policy is moving from a background constraint to a frontline tool for cost control. So in the United States, with the most favored nation, it's less about a single price cut and more about aligning US prices with those of other countries. And outside the United States, reference pricing hasn't changed in concept for a while, but it has changed in force. So countries are watching each other more closely, timelines are tighter, and delays now directly affect patient access, exclusivity, on launch sequencing. So that's, I think, my thoughts on the pricing policy right now.
Why is this moment so pivotal right now?
I think because fiscal pressure is high, basically as seen with MFN, trust in pricing mechanisms are low, and global pricing system are now tightly interdependent, basically. So everybody's looking what the other is doing. So a decision in one market increasingly might shape or reshape behavior everywhere else.
So the interconnectedness of previously somewhat disparate markets is increasing, it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's establish some shared vocabulary for our listeners.
Yes.
Particularly those that don't live and breathe access policy every day in their job, but it is an essential component for them to understand. What exactly is the most favored nation policy, and how does that differ from reference pricing in both its intent and impact?
Perfect. So MFN, or most favored nation, so I will refer MFN right from onwards, I think. So it functions as a price anchoring mechanism where US prices are benchmarked to the lowest observed in selected peer countries, and often without any accounting on how those prices were achieved. I mean, in the benchmark countries. So there are a set of policies, and you might be seeing a chart where there are a couple of policies implemented since January 2026. And this is mostly new because all the policies were announced in between November to December from last year. So that's with MFN. And reference pricing is mostly a negotiation tool. Countries look external prices as a signal, but they still have a trade on volume, access condition, budget caps, and risk sharing. So the difference on MFN and reference pricing is mostly intent. MFN is currently designed to import outcomes, while reference pricing is designed to inform decisions. Both rely on the assumption that prices are transferable across systems, but in reality, prices in Europe often reflect constrained access, delayed launches, or hard budget caps that simply does exist in the US or didn't exist until now, let's say.
And so, in essence, most favored nation is more of a price management tool, whereas reference pricing is more in the negotiation.
Yes, exactly. So basically, as we will see during 2026, in my opinion, MFN is a weaponized anchor or anchor. Sorry, it doesn't just inform; it dictates. It forces a shadow pricing shell game where list prices becomes a form of performance art. Sorry, to protect the U.S. net price while the value-based transparency we need for patient access is being basically eroded. So that's, I mean, my thought on MFN right now.
And why are these tools like MFN and reference pricing so appealing to policymakers?
Uh, so I think because they are attractive, because they appear objective and fast. But when you disconnect price from the system context, you risk copying the number without basically copying the conditions that number were made sustainable. So that's, I think, the key why everybody's looking reference or EMFN looks reference price.
So let's talk a little bit now about the concept behind the idea of these pricing reforms versus the reality. MFN pricing is often framed as fairness issue. Why should the US pay more than any other country is often something we hear here. From an access and an economic perspective, where does that logic break down?
The fairness argument resonates because there are legitimate concerns about affordability and budget sustainability in the United States. But this collapses once you look at how pharmaceutical markets actually work. So prices are not moral judgment. They are negotiated outcomes and shaped by volume guarantees, utilization control, or even willingness to delay or deny access. Many countries pay less precisely because they accept slower access, narrower indication, or strict caps that the United States system has historically avoided. So MFN assumes that if prices converge, access and innovation will stay constant, but ignores how manufacturers manage risks. When prices compress globally, companies doesn't absorb the loss evenly. They rebalance portfolio, delay launches, or even they prioritize higher risk innovation in certain countries. So the real question isn't why does the US pay more? It is who absorbs the risk when prices are forced to converge. And increasingly, that risk lands on future patients and on access timing rather than on a balance sheet alone or a math calculation.
You kicked that off with saying that the prices are not moral judgments, but we end with a statement that that risk then lands on patients and on their access timing. So the unintended consequence is that it becomes a moral choice, is it not?
Yeah, exactly. And uh, that's resonate with global effects of MFN and or even global effects of the price referencing system.
One concern is that MFN doesn't just affect the United States, that it reshapes the global pricing behavior. So there's ripple effects. What are you observing internationally?
Well, MFN doesn't operate in isolation, even through its US policy. So basically, it is changing incentives globally because pricing systems are deeply interconnected. What we're starting to see is a shift from theoretical concern uh, to changes in behaviors in terms of manufacturer behavior, let's say. So many companies, especially mid-sized biotechs, the response is not a full withdrawal from Europe, but is a US first launch sequence. They enable by regulatory decoupling. You can file with the FDA and delay EMA submission by, I don't know, 1 year, 24 months, which helps to protect the US launch price during the most commercially sensitive period. At the same time, the MFN pressure makes lower price markets more strategically risky. So launching earlier in smaller European countries, for example, can create a low price anchor mechanism that fits back into US benchmarking models, like, I don't know, the generous models or the Globe or Guard under MFN. So the result is defensing launch sequencing rather than not launching. It delays filings in terms of regulatory approval and reimbursement submission, or in some cases, there are selective non-launches in certain markets. But I think in the medium term, this creates a paradox because MFN assume that don't hold in real world markets, but pricing policies intended to improve affordability in the US might unintentionally widen access gaps elsewhere, particularly in LMACs, in small European countries with budget constraints, and instead global price convergence that improves equity, for example, we risk having a tier system where access arrives first in priority markets and later or even not arrives in other markets.
External pricing's been around for decades, right? In some form or another. Why does it feel like it's more consequential now, and I dare say even more dangerous now than it did like 10 or 15 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, reference pricing isn't new, you say so. And I think what is new is the environment where reference pricing is operating. So we have more transparency, for more political scrutiny, and tighter alignment even between HTA decisions and reimbursement decisions across different countries. So that makes every price signal louder and faster moving than it was, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, as was said. And at the same time, the system still relies on confidential discounts to function. So if you look basically on price discounting, outcome-based agreement, there is still a lot of confidentiality issues. So as the confidentiality erodes, negotiation becomes less flexible and more brittle, which destabilizes access rather than improve patient access.
Well, it really puts the transparency on a pivot point, that more transparency has unintended consequences, whereas we have lived in a world of less transparency and been dealing with those unintended consequences. Yeah, well, I suppose the determination is, where is the right level of transparency to ultimately protect patients?
I think for me, transparency is how you select the price, how you arrive to that conclusion, and basically assume that that conclusion works for your country, works for your patient system, but might not be workable for others, and this should be disclosed because that will stop looking, for example, the generous model where you look at country and you look the price, but you didn't look how this price was achieved.
Yeah, yeah. So I think this is reflected in today's environment outside of the pharmaceutical industry, but people have previously spoken about Europe as if it's a one-access environment, but we are clearly seeing that it is not truly a singular unit. Why is that one-access environment approach particularly flawed as we think about access and pricing?
I mean, Europe is not a market. Europe is 27 different access systems operating under one political label. And each country from the 27 member states has their own HTA criteria, reimbursement criteria, their budget constraints, and the political pressures, or even tolerance for uncertainty. So what works in a country, let's say Germany, won't automatically work the same in another one. For example, in Italy, Spain, or even Poland. Even if you consider that trial data, clinical data, effectiveness are identical. So my sense is global teams heavily based or heavily centric in US markets often underestimate how much timing and requirements and expectations from even regulators, HTAs, and payers matter in Europe. So a single pricing or a single launch sequence decision in terms of pricing in one country can trigger downstream consequences in other countries through reference pricing or even pricing behavior. So that's my thought on why Europe is not considered one market. It's a region, but with different pricing system, market systems, reimbursement system, and even different characteristics like demography, unmet needs, bar. And I think by 2028, when the new pharmaceutical legislation becomes operationalized, this even be more harder to navigate because companies will face a launch or lose dynamic in Europe at the same time as MFN or MFN-like pricing exposures in the US that, makes launch sequencing is no longer just a commercial choice. It's an IP and access decision. So my key takeaway is when Europe is treated as homogeneous, access strategies often become misaligned.
So let's jump off from there of what pharma organizations, what research and research manufacturers need to be thinking about to be organizationally ready for these changes that have already started. From all of your experience and on the consulting side, as well as your time in industry, what does true organizational readiness look like in terms of European access?
Yeah. So the first, let's demystify something. Having a European office or having no European office but strong local teams isn't enough if the access pathway, the evidence, the clinical strategy, and the policy thinking are still operating in silos. So what I saw in the past is the failures aren't structural in terms. They are mindset and governance failures. So access is still treated as something you deal with the after phase results rather than something that shapes the product development or drug development choices from the beginning. And a common blind spot is assuming that with regulatory approval, you get the access. So companies feel ready because the regulator is satisfied and you get CHMP opinion and you can launch, but then payer hasn't been brought along on the value story. And this is the misalignment I mentioned before. So in terms of operational readiness, for me, it does mean being able to answer payer question, not just the regulators at the time of filing, and doing consistently across markets, across the different 27 member states.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like a lot of staff.
It depends. If you plan early, you don't need a lot of staff. If you don't come prepared, you might need a lot of staff to mitigate the risks.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk timing. How early is early enough when it comes to European access planning?
I think for me, as early as before you log the trial results. So it's not after you generate that, it's before logging. And I think once phase 3 is underway, many of the most important access decisions like comparators, endpoints, population definition are extremely hard to change and are costly. Changing an ongoing trial basically is not is not reliable, I think, and might not be achievable at that stage. So the clinical team understandably focus on statistical significance for regulator, but HTAs are often asking a different question: the relative clinical benefit versus standards of care, which differs across the 27 member states. Mm-hmm. So if those perspectives, HTA perspective, payers perspective, are in line early, no amount of post hoc analysis or secondary assumptions can fully fix the problem. Mm-hmm. So I think in terms of myths, my myth on access is that you can repair a weak evidence package after approval. That's not happening. By that point, the strategic choice had already expired. Mm-hmm.
So let's do a reality check here. There is more coordination across Europe, and there was the hope for simplification as a result. Has that been borne out? Are things truly more simple, or is this just a new layer of complexity?
I think there is coordination, and there has been real progress on making this coordination workable, especially on the regulatory side. But it hasn't simplified access in the way many people expected, 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. So with current initiatives like the EU showing clinical assessment under the HTA regulation, they try to harmonize parts of relative effectiveness assessment. So the JCA runs in parallel with the EMA review, requiring a dossier submit before regulatory approval. And when you combine these policies with US policies, for example, with the MFN exposure in the US and diverse national pricing negotiation in Europe, companies are managing multiple high-stake processes simultaneously. And this is particularly challenging for small companies or small biotechs or small SMEs. So coordination raises the bar for organizational readiness. Mm-hmm. And it favors companies. You ask in the previous question if more staff. So coordination favors companies with deep cross-functional integration and enough resources. Mm-hmm. While those small players, those small SMEs might be pushed toward delaying filing, licensing partnership with national pharma companies or even selective market entry. So coordination does not look simplification. We are seeing a redistribution of complexity that fundamentally reshapes who can navigate the system effectively.
So this coordination sort of raises the stakes.
Yes. Okay.
Let's pivot a little bit to one of your hobbies, CrossFit. You do CrossFit coaching, and you have noted in prior conversations with me that you've leaned on this a lot to think about how you use CrossFit coaching to explain, demonstrate, practice, correct. Tell me how you apply that to value-based communication and market access.
So yeah, I really enjoy being a CrossFit athlete and coaching. In CrossFit coaching, explaining the movement isn't enough. So I have to explain, then I have to demonstrate, let people practice, and correct correct them basically. And for me, access works on the same way. In market access, we are very strong on explanation. We have our dossiers, we have value narrative, our models, but understanding only happens when decision makers can see how the evidence plays out in the real systems. National budget, patient pathway, and trade-off. That's why early dialogue and pilots and iterative feedback matter for value communication.
So you and I have talked a little bit about how easy it is to live in science and policy and miss the story. What does it mean to tell an access story that really lands with payers and policymakers and patients? What's your secret?
I mean, for me, good communication is less about persuasion and more about credibility. So when pricing systems are under fiscal pressure, decision makers are wary of narratives that feel optimized or absolute. So, and credibility comes from being explicit about uncertainty, about trade-offs and limitation. What the evidence can and cannot support. That's especially important, for example, under MFN style policies, where pricing tools more faster than the normal understanding. When the manufacturer communicate with that level of transparency, it doesn't weaken their position. It strengthens trust. And in this global pricing environment, trust is often the difference between delay access and sustain access.
Let's move to the rapid fire.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a series of questions. You'll respond with one or two words or a short answer.
Perfect.
Ramiro, what is one access capability every company underinvests in?
Early access intelligence, connecting clinical design, HTA and payer expectations, and launch sequencing before phase 3.
What is the biggest access myth that is still alive today?
That you can fix after the regulatory approval.
The horse is out of the barn.
Yes.
Is a saying here.
Yes.
One policy idea that sounds good, but it scares you.
Well, you might not be surprised what I'm going to say, but it's the policy that assumes that the prices are comparable across countries without considering how patient access actually happens. Doesn't look like to something timely.
CrossFit or market access, which is harder to coach?
Okay. I think market access, because you don't control the environment. like in a CrossFit class, and everyone thinks they already know the skills and the movements, or the rules they need to have on those standards.
Perhaps we need New Year's resolutions and market access to get back in the gym.
Yeah.
Evidence or story? If you had to choose one first, what would that be?
Being a science person, I choose a story, because without the story, the evidence doesn't get communicated.
I'm surprised by that answer. I thought you might have said trust as the most important first step.
Well, trust, I mean, we are keep saying trust in all access discussion from, I don't know, 15 years when I started. So trust, I mean, for me is, if we don't have trust, there is no story, there is no evidence, there is no anything. So trust is the cornerstone here, is the North Star, let's say. So we don't start talking if we don't trust each other.
There's a quote that I learned a few years ago, and I lean on this so many times. And that quote is, change happens at the speed of trust.
Exactly. That's a very, I mean, it still lasts. So it's a quote that lasts for novels. So.
Yeah, it's venerable.
Yeah.
What makes you optimistic right now?
On my professional side, that currently more people are finally acknowledging that system doesn't work, and that's the first step to fix something, saying this is not working. And besides the upcoming CrossFit competition events season.
What's your best event in CrossFit?
Well, I can't pass on the CrossFit Games, which start with the open games for everybody. There are events across end of February and March, and if you practice CrossFit, you can do that in your CrossFit gym, and that are the cornerstone from a good, very nice competition by August, where the fittest people in the world get a ticket to get in. But there are a lot of national competences, challenges that you can go and have fun. So I do this for fun and not for a competition style.
Well, best of luck to you on this upcoming competition.
Thank you.
Today's conversation with Dr. Ramiro Gilardino has brought clarity and depth to two of the most consequential topics in health policy and market access right now: the evolving economics of pricing reform with most favored nation approaches in the U.S. and reference pricing models outside the U.S., and the practical challenges of building access excellence across a fragmented European landscape. He reminded us that pricing reforms are not just technical levers. They carry profound implications for innovation incentives, patient equity, and global launch strategies. And I want to thank you so much, Ramiro, for sitting with us and helping to educate us on these important pricing reforms that are happening, the things you're thinking about and working with your clients on, and for sitting with us and sharing some of your professional and personal life.
Thanks, Patty, for that. And I think this is a nice year to get educating about policy and pricing policy, because I think more to come. So looking forward.
More to come indeed. Thank you, Ramiro.